Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be learning how to draw eyes. Now, there are many ways to go about drawing eyes. In one sense, there is the classical approach where you try to just draw what you see, and in one way this is a great way to just practice drawing eyes from life, and this is one way to draw eyes and practice capturing details as you see them in a naturalistic way. However, in order to really gain a really good sense of how to form eyes in a drawing, how to make them seem symmetrical, we will be going with a more diagrammatical approach. And the way in which we can start this drawing process is to start with a light pencil, where we're going to draw a vertical line down the page with a horizontal line going through that vertical line. Now we want to kind of draw it as if we were drawing a cross shape, so we want to make sure that that horizontal line is kind of placed quite high above on the vertical line. From there, what we're going to do is draw two more vertical lines directly next to that first vertical line on either side. So with your pencil, make sure that you draw a perfectly parallel or two perfectly parallel vertical lines on either side of that first vertical line. And what this is going to do is it's going to set up the inner corners of the eyes. So basically, this is going to help us establish a starting point from the inner corners of each eye and how to form the eye from that point. To further help us in terms of how to heighten each eye, how high they should be extended, we can draw another horizontal line that runs parallel with that first horizontal line we drew. So we just want to make sure this horizontal line we draw is above the first horizontal line, and we want to make sure that the spacing between those two horizontal lines are the same as the spacing between the three vertical lines that we drew. Now we can proceed by actually starting to draw the eyes. In order to draw a more classical feminine type eye shape, what we're going to do is we're going to draw these kind of leaf-like structures, arrow leaf-like structures, where the eyes kind of round out in the middle where the main surface area would be, and then start to narrow near the edges. Now the inner edges of the eye kind of have this downturn hook little shape, whereas the outer edges are just a more classic football-like corner that just narrow to a point. Now, as we draw this football or leaf-like structure, we want to make sure that we arc through the first horizontal line. So basically, the bottom eyelids will go over that first horizontal line and arc back upwards to the outer corners of the eye. Then as they arc upward, they will meet or touch the top horizontal line, but they won't go over that top horizontal line. So the bottom horizontal line kind of establishes where the inner corners of the eyes start, but then as the bottom eyelids arc downwards, they go over that first horizontal line. Now make sure you take your time really trying to capture the shape. The intention here is to use these guidelines. You can use your eraser and your pencil and just make sure that your eyes are as symmetrical as possible. The main thing we really want to capture is just that the eye shapes have that football or leaf-like structure with the downturn curves towards the inner edges of the eye. Now we can start moving on to actually drawing in the details and features of the eye, and this is where we start forming the iris. Now when eyes are resting, technically what is happening is the top eyelids are covering about 10 to 20% of the eyeball, and this means that the iris is slightly cut off near the top. So basically it is this perfect circular structure, however it is slightly cut off near the top. So what we want to do is with our pencils, we want to make sure that we're drawing this perfect circular shape and basically making sure that it is slightly cut off near its top section. And we also want to make sure that we place this perfect circular shape directly in the center of each eye. Now we can proceed by drawing in the pupils, and the way in which we draw the pupils is the pupils are kind of this other perfect circular shape that is placed directly in the center of the iris. We want to make sure that there's even spacing in between the line that forms the iris and the line that forms the pupil. Again, take your time, you don't have to rush, but now once we have done this, we have set up the main demarcated lines that we are going to start working in more refined details, and this is where it starts to get fun. So with our pencils, what we're going to start to do is we're going to lightly sketch in these little lines or strokes of lines along the rim of the iris. Now, this is where we're going to start shading and adding in some vague line work. So once we've added in some light lines along the rim of the iris, we can start adding in some of these parallel lines that move along the upper eyelid to bring out more three-dimensional structure within the upper eyelid. Now, from the top corner points of the two outer vertical lines and the top horizontal line, these are going to establish where the eyebrows start. Again, the way in which we form eyebrows is completely up to you. However, in terms of trying to practice our ability to create symmetry, I think the best thing to do is to try and keep the eyebrow shape as clean and simple as possible. Now, eyebrows have this arch in shape. They kind of move upward and outward from the inner corner areas of the top eyelids. So we want to make sure that we use these diagrammatical lines to really assist us in the placement of the two inner corner points of the eyebrows and how they move up and outward over the eyes. Again, we kind of want to just make sure that we keep them the same shape. A good suggestion is to also make sure that they sharpen or narrow as they come to the outer edges of the eyebrow. Now, as we proceed, what we want to do is we want to start working in some light shading to start forming the indentations of the eyes around the brow. And what we're going to do is we're going to start adding some shading and some line work that flows from the inner corners of the eyebrows down the sides of the nose, or what is going to form the ridge of the nose. And this is just going to contextualize the shape and form of the eye sockets. So generally, obviously, eyes sit within a skull, and what that does is it causes protrusions in the skin as it presses against the skin, which causes a lot of shadowing around the eyes and the brow ridge. So what we want to do is we want to start working the shadowing just above the upper eyelids and slightly moving along the sides or along both sides of the nose ridge. What we can also start doing is we can also start adding some shading along the bottom eyelids, and the idea here is the same. We just want to create some three-dimensionality along the bottom eyelids and kind of allow that shading or that three-dimensional kind of protrusion developed by the shading to flow into the ridge of the nose, or the shading that is defining the ridge of the nose. Now, make sure you just take your time. You don't need to rush it. Make sure you work in these shading marks along the bottom of the eyes, along the upper eyelids, beneath the brow, along the ridge of the nose, just to really bring out a three-dimensional quality in the facial features surrounding the eyes. Now, once we have done this, we can start moving on to working with our pens. The pencil marks and the shading marks are going to be used now as a guideline to assist us as we add in some pen shading, just to give the drawing a little bit more detail, more contrast, and to emphasize these features in a more realistic way. Now, the best way we can start is we can take our pens and we can start to actually blacken out the pupils. However, as we do so, we want to leave a little bit of negative space in the pupils to suggest a reflection of light or highlight in the pupils. By doing this, we're also going to emphasize the glossy quality or the reflective quality of the surface of the eye. Now, the most detailed feature of the eye is the iris, and basically the iris always has these unique patterns and shapes, which is often the cloudy colored qualities of the eye. The way in which we represent this within our drawing is we want to work with our pencils in tandem with our pen to create these little strokes of lines that connect between the pupil and the rim, the outer rim of the iris. Now, the idea is that pupils dilate, and this means that they kind of like this orifice that opens and closes, so they're not perfectly circular. So what we want to do is we kind of want to make little lines that move along the outer rim of the pupil and the inner rim of the iris. The idea is that these little strokes of lines connect between the pupil and the iris, and basically what we want to do is we can darken the edge of the iris and make these strokes kind of flow towards the pupil, and this is going to give it a three-dimensional quality. And we can do the same for the pupil. We can make little lines flow from the pupil towards the iris. But just take your time with this, work with a negative space and line work to create a combination of these light and darker moments of shading. Now, once that's done, we can move on to using our ballpoint pens to kind of now go over the shading of the surrounding features. And this is where we can start working shading over the pencil marks, using these pencil shading marks to kind of guide us. So the idea here is with ballpoint pen is very similar to pencil. The idea is that the ink of ballpoint pens comes out quite sparingly, so we kind of want to treat it as if we were shading with a pencil. Now, as you start shading, you can start working around the eyelids, and I would suggest starting with the lower sections of the eyes. And this is where you want to softly and with a very gentle touch slowly go over these shading marks, working over the pencil marks as a means of guiding you. Now, what we can also start doing is we can start contextualizing the eyes a little further by drawing in the eyelashes. So the eyelashes, we want to consider them as these strokes of lines. That's basically what these little hair fibers are. They're little strokes of lines that sit on the top eyelid. So what we want to do with our pens is we want to start darkening the upper eyelid and start working in these little curved lines at the outer edges of the eyes. Now, this is kind of going to just slightly darken the eyes and give the eyes a little bit more of a feminine touch. We really want to make sure that we add some curvature to the eyelashes, as this is a really good way to feminize the eyes. From there, what we can do is we can start working our pen shading over the upper eyelids as well. And this is where we start to be a little bit more conscious of how skin creates these little creases or wrinkles. So obviously, because the upper eyelid rests over the circular eyeball structure, what is happening is it's creating this little darkened crease just above the eye, and below the brow ridge. And what's happening here is there's going to be a gradient of shadow, because within the crease, obviously light struggles to penetrate it. So what's going to happen is that crease is going to be very dark, but as the skin becomes more exposed to the light source in a more spread out surface area, those areas will be slightly lighter, and this is where we can start to create little gradients within the skin to give it more three-dimensionality. So a good suggestion would be to just take your time, again, slowly building up these layers of pen shading. You really want to make sure that you're treating your pen shading very similar to that of a pencil, where you slowly work these soft shading marks over one another, building up these layers until you get to a desired tonal value within the drawing. The upper eyelids are a feature that we really want to make sure we are subtle with our shading. It's really important for us to create these gradients, especially in moments where there are protrusions and indentations in the skin, because this is obviously going to be the distinguishing little features that describe three-dimensionality and how little structures in the eye move forward or outward. And all of these little structures obviously are interacting with light and therefore casting these shadows. And that's why we create this shadowed light sketch of the pencil first before we use pen, so we can kind of use that as a guideline to understand where the shadows would be placed based off of how the structure of the eye socket obviously creates these different moments of indentation and protrusion. Now, something that's also really important is that the upper eyelids are obviously resting over the eyeball. So what this is also creating is a little subtle shadowing that moves along the upper section of the eyeball. And this shadowing goes over the entire iris as well as the pupil. So with the upper eyelid, we really want to make sure that we're darkening the line of the upper eyelid. And that's where we're going to draw in these eyelashes that curve up and outward, but we also want to be aware of how this structure, because it is overlapping onto the eyeball, is going to cast a subtle shadowing. So this is kind of what we want to think about as we draw in these features. We really want to be conscious of how the anatomy is basically these little structures stacked on top of each other and protruding and indented in certain ways that causes shadowing to form around the eyes. Something important to note is that with the eyelashes, because they're basically just these lines, because that is what a hair fiber is, it's a single line and can be drawn as such, we can kind of add that in after we have added shading along the upper eyelid structure. So we want to make sure that we kind of adding the smooth shading first before the line work. What this is also going to do is it's going to establish a more realistic stacking effect, where obviously the eyelash is resting over or curving upward and in the foreground in front of the upper eyelid. So we want to make sure that as we add in these eyelashes, first establish the shading along the upper eyelids, and then you can add in these eyelashes. When it comes to the lower eyelashes, we also want to be aware of the fact that the lower eyelashes are generally smaller than the upper eyelashes. So the lower eyelashes, or the eyelashes that sit on the bottom eyelid, are normally more straight and curved downward. They're also a lot less than the top eyelashes. So we want to be a little bit more sparing with the amount of eyelashes that we put along the bottom eyelid, and these can kind of slightly curve downward, or they tend to be more straight. So just try to be conscious of this. Another good suggestion to kind of create more three-dimensionality along both the upper and lower eyelid is that you kind of leave a strip of negative space. So basically what you're doing is you're creating the subtle shading gradient that moves along both the upper and lower eyelid, but just before you reach the actual line that defines the upper and lower eyelid, you leave a little space or a little strip of negative space, and this is basically going to give it a highlight or an effect of light interacting with the surface of the skin. Something else now that we can consider is just simply enhancing the contrast along the ridge of the nose, and this is where we simply are very light with our hand as we create the smooth shading mark over the pencil shading as a means of guiding us. Now, this process is simply a matter of time. You just want to take your time. You also don't want to overdo it. The main dark aspects of the eye tend to be near the eyelashes, and how the shadowing is cast more near the upper eyelid, where there's creases in the eye, where there are more distinct moments of protrusion, or any structure that would kind of overlap another structure and cause a more stark shadowing. And this is particularly true for the upper eyelid, and how shadowing is formed by both the eyelid and the eyelashes themselves. Now, once we have kind of drawn and established a darker tonal value within this eye drawing, we basically want to build up these gradients. And this is where it just takes time. This is where we are patient and slowly build up these layers of shading with our ballpoint pen, slowly going over them until we are satisfied. Once we have done that, we can actually move on to defining the eyebrows a little bit more distinctly, and this is very simple. So obviously, again, when we think about hair structures and the way they kind of look aesthetically in the face, they are basically these lines, and that's because that is what a hair structure looks like. It is a stroke, it is a single line, and it's just a matter of them being stacked together or compiled together to create a hair-like feature on the face. And that's the same for the eyebrows. The hairs of the eyebrow, important to note though, kind of move outward from the center of the face, so they don't move inward. And this is something we want to consider, because as we make these little strokes with our pen, and what's basically going to happen is we're going to add pressure to the pen and then have this subtle release with each stroke, which basically means that the base of the stroke is going to be slightly darker, and as we make the stroke and release, it's going to get more thin or narrow, and therefore more faint. And this is a good technique, especially to establish this idea of a hair follicle in the eyebrows, where the base of the hair follicle is slightly thicker than the tip of the hair follicle. So now basically what we want to do is, in the structure that we have drawn for each eyebrow, we want to build up these little hair-like strokes by making these lines, and we want to do it from the inside of each eyebrow, moving towards the outer edges of each eyebrow. And this is going to establish that the way in which hairs actually sit and move out from the center of the face within the eyebrows. What you can also do is you can establish these little lines first with pencil. If you feel that you don't want to do it with pen the first time, that's okay. It also is just an added layer of tonal values to bring a little bit more texture to the eyebrows, or you can just go straight with your pen. Other than that, what we can now do is we can slowly work through the entire drawing. So at this point we should have a drawn pair of eyes. We should have worked in details into the iris. We should have this negative space, or these little negative shapes within the pupil to establish reflection. We should have shadowing that forms along the upper and lower eyelids and flow into the ridge of the nose, as well as shading that is formed from the creases near the top eyelids below the eyebrow ridge. But now this part of the process is simply a matter of going over all of these features a little bit, slowly darkening anything that needs to be darkened. We can also create gradients that flow from the upper eyelids towards the outer edges of the eyebrows to give a little bit more dimension to the brow ridge. But other than that, guys, this is the basic process of how to draw eyes. It's simply a matter of establishing shape. It's about building up these little details in pencil first. It is then about building up your layers of shading, how you kind of establish where the shading is going to be placed, and then it's about putting in some darker shading and being a little bit more strategic with how you use darker materials or tools such as pen or charcoal if you want to go that route. But it's now simply a matter of building up these layers to create more three-dimensionality and a little bit more contrast in the drawing. Other than that, guys, really important things to note is that you really want to build up eyes in layers. You want to start basic and slowly refine with each process of details, shading, and then more refined shading towards the end. Otherwise, this is the basic process of how to draw a set of eyes, guys. I hope this content was helpful. If so, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video. Cheers.